the Lagos Plan of Action. Today we're going to continue our discussion on the African Union. And there are many things and many events that happen within the African Union. We are going to go back into history a little bit to talk about the Lagos Plan of Action. We'll discuss the Lagos Plan of Action today. And then next week we'll discuss the Abuja Treaty. We're discussing these things so that you know the evolution, or you see the steps that the African Union is taking to create as a continental institution. The Lagos Action Plan for Economic Development in Africa, which was between 2000, that's in 1980 to 2000, commonly known as LPA. That's not Liberia Pay After. In my country, Liberia Pay After is a credit system. We should call it LPA, Liberia Pay After. It's like almost like the way in the United States you get the credit card and stuff. So you take the goods and you pay after. That used to be something that happened way back when I was growing up as a little boy in the early 70s, early 80s and stuff like that. It's one of the most important economic blueprints for ever adopted by African leaders. It was approved by the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNICA, at the second extraordinary summit. Just think about it, way back of the African Union here in Lagos, Nigeria, from 29 April 1980. That's a bad month for us in Liberia, 1980, April 1980. The plan represents Africa's most comprehensive Africa-designed strategic economic development, right? Rather than relying on externally prescribed development model, the LPA calls for African countries to build self-reliance economic through regional integration, industrialization, agricultural modernization, and collective action. Though many of its objectives were not fully realized, the Lagos Action Plan profoundly influenced later initiatives, including the Abuja Treaty in 1991, which we'll talk about in our next video. The creation of the African Economic Community, AEC, we'll talk about that in a separate video. Agenda 2063, we already talked about Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Area. We already talked about this in the video. If you want to learn about African Union, if you want to know about regional economic communities in Africa, this is the channel for you. We are the only channel devoted to explaining the different organs, specialized agencies within the African Union and the various regional blocks. So if you want to know about the history, the politics, the geopolitical connection between these organizations and the African Union and global organizations, come over here. We'll tell you about it. Let's look at the historical context of the Lagos Plan of Action. By the late 1970s, most African countries have achieved political independence. However, independence did not bring economic independence. Many African countries remain characterized by heavy dependence on export of raw materials such as cocoa, coffee, copper, cotton, oil, and minerals, limited industrial capacity, dependence on imported manufactured goods, weak transportation and energy infrastructure, high level of external debts, or heavy reliance on foreign aid. These structural weaknesses left African economies vulnerable to global economic shocks. So that's the underpinning. That's like the background behind the Lagos action plan. The global economic shock, several international developments exposed this vulnerability. The 1973 oil crisis sharply increased import costs for many African countries. The second oil shock in 1979 further strained national budgets. Global inflation and recession reduced demand for African exports. Commodity prices declined while costs for imported manufactured goods increased. Rising interest rates made external borrowing more expensive. As a result, many African governments concluded that the continent needed a development strategy designed by Africans rather than one imposed by external institutions. African leaders believe existing development models have failed because they encourage dependency on former colonial powers, prioritize exporting raw materials instead of developing other value industry, increase reliance on imports, did little to foster trade among African countries. The Lagos Plan sought to reverse this pattern by promoting economic self-reliance, regional integration, industrial development, food security, technological advancement, collective bargaining in international economic affairs. The central message was that Africa should chart its own development path. So that's the Lagos Plan of Action. Now, who were the key people that were behind this particular Lagos Plan of Action? The Lagos Plan of Action was a product of collective leadership, but there were several figures who particularly influenced the Lagos Plan of Action. Shehu Shagari of Nigeria, as host of the Lagos Summit, President Shagari played a pivotal role in bringing African leaders together to adapt the plan. Nigeria's economic and political influence at the time gave significant momentum to the initiative. Then you get Eden Kojo. Eden Kojo is one of the Secretary Generals of the African Union that I'm familiar with when I began to follow politics, African politics since 1970, when I was about 10. Eden Kojo was one of the guys I used to admire. It was surprising at a young age of being interested in African politics. Eden Kojo was one of the principal architects and advocates of the Lagos Plan. He urged that political independence could remain incomplete without economic independence. And under his leadership, the Organization of African Union shifted its attention towards economic integration, regional cooperation, industrialization, infrastructure development. Kojo was instrumental in building consensus among member states and promoting the plan within the OAU, that is the Organization of African Unity. Eden Kojo was the Secretary General of the African Union. Then you have Adejo. He's from Nigeria. Professor Adejo was Professor Adebayo was widely regarded as the intellectual architect of the Lagos Plan of Action. He championed the concept of collective self-reliance, regional markets, African-led industrial policy, economic integration. His economic analysis and policy proposals informed much of the technical foundation of the plan. Then you get Julius Nyerere. You also have Kenneth David Kaunda of Zambia. You have Leopold Senghor of Senegal. You have Sareti Kame of Botswana, Daniel Aramwa of Kenya, then Sekou Touré of Guinea. These guys were the guys who drafted the Lagos Plan of Action for the organization. You remember that this is the Organization of African Unity we're talking about, and the Lagos Plan of Action was the Lagos Plan of Action is not a treaty. That is why I say we discuss the Abuja Treaty, and after discussing the Lagos Plan of Action. Now, the main objectives of the Lagos Plan of Action were agriculture, recognizing agriculture as the backbone for most African economy. The plan calls for increased food production, achieving food self-sufficiency, expanding irrigation, improving agricultural research, supporting smallholder farms, and reducing dependency on imported food. So we're talking about the 1980, the Lagos Action Plan. Then we talk about industrialization. The plan was to processing African raw materials within Africa, building industrial and manufacturing industries, promoting technology transfer, developing heavy industry, encouraging Africa-owned enterprises. So these were some of the things that were on the Lagos Plan. So if you look at the Lagos Plan, and when we discuss the Abuja Treaty, and then you will see the connections between these two plans. The Lagos Plan was just a plan, political ambition of African leaders. But then the Abuja Treaty, which we'll discuss next, will show you where most of the things that were discussed within the Lagos Plan were all transferred into the Abuja Treaty. Principle of the Lagos Plan. The plan rested on several core principles: collective self-reliance, African ownership of development, regional integration, economic diversification, reduce external dependencies, sustainable development, social justice, and equitable growth. So let us briefly look at the relationship between the relationship to the Abuja Treaty. We'll discuss the Abuja Treaty in full detail in a separate video. The Lagos Plan laid the conceptual framework for the Abuja Treaty, signed in 1991, which established the African Economic Community, and we'll discuss the African Economic Community in a separate video. So that watch out for those 3 separate videos. So if you're watching this video, watch the Lagos Action Plan first, then you watch the Abuja Treaty, and then you watch the African Economic Community. The treaty translated many of the plan's ideas into a legally bound framework, including the phased approach to continental economic integration through strengthening regional economic communities, free trade areas, custom duties or custom unions, a common market, and ultimately an economic and monetary union. Why the Lagos Plan was not fully implemented, you may ask that question. Despite its ambition vision, implementation faced major obstacles as many African unions initiatives. The debt crisis in the 1980s. Structural adjustment promoted by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which often emphasized fiscal austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization over state-led industrial policies. Political instability, coups, and armed conflicts, weak institutional capacity, limited financial resources, inadequate coordination among member states, continued dependence on commodity export. These challenges slowed or prevented many of the plan's objectives from being achieved. So that's some of the challenges that the Lagos Action Plan faced. The long-term legacy of the Lagos Action Plan. Though implementation fell short, the Lagos Action Plan remains one of Africa's most influential development frameworks. Its ideas continue to shape continental policy through the Abuja Treaty of 1991 and the African Economic Community, as I said, we'll talk about, strengthened regional economic communities. The Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, we'll talk about PIDA. If you have not watched our video on PIDA, PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, go and watch that. The Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. Agenda 2063, the African Union's long-term strategic framework. The African Continental Free Trade Area. We also talk about in-depth of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Many contemporary AU priorities, including expanding African Union trade. That's an intra-African trade, developing regional value chains, investing in infrastructure, and promoting industrialization reflects principles first articulated in the Lagos Action Plan, or Lagos Plan of Action. Folks, the Lagos Plan of Action was more than an economic policy document. It was a declaration that Africa should define its own development trajectory. Leaders such as Ide Kojo, Shehu Shagari, Adebayo, Adejo, Julius Nyerere, and Kenneth Kaunda were among other leaders, sought to move the continent beyond political liberation toward economic transformation. While external economic pressures and domestic challenges limited its implementation, the Lagos Plan of Action established the intellectual and policy foundation for much of Africa's regional integration agenda that continues under the African Union today. Folks, the reason I try to explain these things to us so that we would know the different stages that the African Union has passed through, the evolution of the African Union, from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, and some of those documents, those treaties and those protocols and the plan of actions that get us to this point today. So, folks, the African Union is doing its level best to move us to the continent we want. It's going to take time, but we are getting there. And it needs all of us input to get us there. Folks, if you want to get an in-depth analysis of African issue, come to the dust when the dust settles. Until next time, my name is Pico Conway. I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye for now.